Hegelians, welcome philosophers, scholars, and saints. We are back finally with another lecture slash podcast slash discussion. This time I'm going to be talking about, let's see, what should I start with? Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. I have the translation by Stambaugh. I'm going to be talking right smack in the middle of this book on Division 2. It's the sort of the introduction to Division 2, so it's section 45, because I really think that by the time you get to, and if you have this version, it is page 221, and it is the German 231. So there we go. Lots of locations for you. Because I think that when you are reading Being and Time, maybe for the first time, when you get to section 45, it's a good summary of what you've just read. And if you're like me, you feel like, oh, I should go back and read that first section. So the book is called Being and Time, and I think he is intending to have the first half, the first division, be about being, but a specific type of being, and Division 2 to be about time, because the name of Division 2 is Dasein and Temporality. And okay, so let's just get started. I was supposed to have a reading group on this actually, so probably I would have had more ideas, but something was said in the beginning of the group that just felt insulting and offensive, and which sometimes happens in groups, sometimes in graduate school discussions, and the reading groups that I go to are kind of like graduate school light. So, I just couldn't concentrate, and I had to read this on my own. So here we go. We are going to talk about it. Okay, so this is titled The Result of the Preparatory Fundamental Analysis of Dasein and the Task of a Primordial Existential Interpretation of This Being. So that for me sounds kind of general and doesn't give me a lot, except for the word primordial. And it's not the first time that he is using that word, but it does stand out to me anyway. I just feel like having an existential interpretation of being, he has these two words in these two descriptions, right? Existential and existential. And it's spelled a little bit differently, the existential. So does that mean in part 1 he was mainly talking about the more factual, boundary-oriented, limited being? I don't think so. He kind of talks about everything all the time, except maybe time. So I'm not sure we can gain a lot of that, but his first sentence really shows that this section right here is a summary, and it could be, if you are just wanting to dive into this book, just go ahead and read section 45 first, and it will give you a bit of a summary, or just, listen to my thoughts. So it starts off with a question. What was gained by our preparatory analysis of Dasein, and what are we looking for? So it's good that, he doesn't assume that we know. So it says, we have found the fundamental constitution of the being in question, being in the world. So this isn't just, so Heidegger doesn't want to just, remember, Heidegger is all about phenomenology, right? And phenomenology looks at phenomena as we experience them. So it's not necessarily thinking about the underlying, causes or elements in a sense. It's what we can encounter and experience. And the being that is our being, sort of the being of the human, is always in the world. We have our private thoughts that seem, sort of closed in. They're contained, I think we can probably imagine as if they were contained within our own the boundaries of our physical body. And so it seems like it's separate from the world. But it probably isn't. And maybe that's contradictory to what I just said, because phenomenology is what our experience is, and maybe our experience is that we can be a part of the world. And so, but there's something to be said for examining our experience and can we widen our experience? We can't really widen our experience to look at a tree and just know, even if we have different mindsets or look from different perspectives, we can't know the DNA sequence of, the tree. So, but we can, but that's still, it's not all or nothing. We can still go deeper into our experience and kind of see how we are always entangled and enmeshed in the world. So anyway, so this is his idea. And it's a good kind of subject of, asking because of inquiry, because it is sort of confusing and curious, who we are, what we are. What does our consciousness contain? How in control can we be of our consciousness and our thoughts? And what does it mean to quiet our thoughts and to be as as Eastern philosophies and spiritualities might suggest, even existentialism might suggest, to be present in the moment and to be a more authentic self, because Heidegger is very interested in the authentic self as well, and even suggests in this section that part 1 is mostly about the inauthentic Dasein, and Dasein just means the German word for this particular facet of being, or the particular being that we're kind of focusing on, the quality, the content. And part 2, which is about time, but time is used to discuss the authentic Dasein. Because the first section, is about the thrownness, right? The thrownness into the they, and how we're always kind of going back and forth between the they, and he talks about falling prey and idle talk in the first section, even though he also talks about care, and which doesn't necessarily mean that we feel nurturing. It's not the care that's always nurturing. It's the care that just indicates an activity. So he's going to continue on to talk about that. And none of these things are really, it's not necessarily that he's looking at it judgmentally, like it's bad to be inauthentic, it's bad to be falling prey to the they, it's bad to delve into idle talk. He's just trying to really figure out and describe our essential constitution, who we are, what is the state of our being. Because I think that uncertainty and unknowing, that it's kind of confusing, what we are, who we are, what we want, what would make us happy. And so it causes some sort of distress because we are a being, but we also find our being mysterious. And part of the problem is, for Heidegger, which he tries to present a solution for in his sort of, coined words, his neologisms. I sometimes avoid that word because I just feel like I'm not pronouncing it correctly. Because our language is good is fine, is sufficient for speaking about, what we do during the day, describing our world, what we can see. But it's not so good for describing more existential kind of things. And so there's a factual there are factual entities that we experience, but there are also these sort of entities or aspects that we can't really draw boundaries and limits around. And when we can't draw boundaries and limits around something, it gets a little blurry and it gets a little more elusive, like it escapes our grasp. And he's really trying to help us with that more elusive part, but it ties into the factual part. So that's why he needs existential or ontic, because those terms refer to the more accessible kind of entities and aspects. And so, every time he's using those words, that's what he's talking about, the more sort of exact and graspable aspects. So anyway, he talks about, the ambiguity, sort of the anxiousness, even the existential crisis. He kind of has to start with, I guess, or he is starting with the problem so he can maybe give us the solution, which maybe that's actually a horrible way of thinking of it. But I think it's hard for us. We all want to be more authentic. We all want to be more calm and to solve these sort of feelings of distress that we have. And I think that, especially ever since the Enlightenment, but maybe always, human beings have sought clarity as sort of a healing salve for the mind. If we can understand, then we can be calm. But then, of course, you have, people saying the more you increase your knowledge, the more you increase your suffering. So perhaps it's a double-edged sword. But anyway, so you can see that he's also talking about authenticity, right? In the first section he says, authentic silence is possible only in genuine discourse. I'm trying to go back, and he's really talking about entanglement, but again, he's, so my first point way back in I don't know, many sentences ago was basically his sort of attempt to be neutral with using this language that is often characterized as or seen as something most people want to avoid, right? But for instance, he says in section 38, which is in the German 176 on page 169, inauthenticity does not mean anything like no longer being in the world, but rather it constitutes precisely a distinctive kind of being in the world. And I think that's, pretty easy for us to understand. But then, he even says something about this falling prey, which sounds, not great. Do we want to fall prey? But he says, the falling prey of Dasein must not be interpreted as a fall, he puts this in quotes, from a pure and higher primordial condition. So that's why I think primordial really going back to the section that we're actually going to talk about, 45, that's why I think primordial comes up, because, you have, especially in certain religions like Christianity, you have the fall from grace. The reason that humanity is so chaotic and unhappy and dissatisfied and toiling, because we disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, and we could have had this perfect, idyllic life, but we fell. So that word fall, but he uses the word fall and to fall prey as, not something from a pure state that is sort of solid and has some sort of continuity, continuousness that we can go back in time to see. I think really he looks at whatever states we are in as constantly moving and going back and forth. We're falling prey, but we do have to fall from somewhere. So, and there's thrownness, but there's always movement, and that's true. And he talks more about that in Division 2, how you have moments of sort of authenticity, let's say, and maybe even purity, but it only lasts for so long. And you're always finding the other side of the coin. The pendulum's always moving to the other side. So anyway, primordial is really interesting because he kind of is saying, I think, that whatever we are and whoever we are is always what we are until we're not. And, and that means death. But being in the world is what we are. That our Dassain, one characteristic of our Dasein, is being in the world. And that's why he says we have found the fundamental constitution of the being in question, being in the world. And then he says whose essential structures are centered in disclosedness. So if I'm remembering this right, what is disclosed means what is revealed. That's not a word that I personally use a lot. And so again, harkens back to phenomenology. So that's something that can kind of give us assurance, is he's not talking about anything that we can't experience. He's just trying to get us to go deeper into our experience. So he says the totality of the structural whole revealed itself in care. So care is really important. The being of Dasein is contained in care. And I wish I had a really good quote for this. But basically, caring or being in care just means all the things we do. We're always doing something. Our being is a doing being. We are always trying to get better and improve. We're always seeking something, whether it's seeking how can I be happier, or what job do I want? We're always contemplating what our feelings are. What am I really feeling? Do I really like this person? What should I say? How should I articulate it? Or we're working on our house, or we're reading, or we are, even when we are sitting still, if we're thinking, our thinking is of the status of care. We're always trying to take care of something in that sense. So again, not necessarily, oh, I care for you. It's nurturing, it's affectionate. It's just the neutral idea of we're always in a state of, flux, I guess. And he talks about in the first section, attunement and mood, just more talking about this, what does being in the world mean? And again, and I just saw this, it's in the end of chapter 4, the German 130, page 126, he talks about the authentic self here. So even though section 2 is the authentic self, he still talks about authenticity. Like the structure of his book is analogous to the structure and the content and the quality of our being. It goes back and forth. So he says, authentic being a self is not based on an exceptional state of the subject. So he keeps wanting to remind us he's being neutral. He's not using the connotation that we usually apply to these words. Detached from the they, the they doesn't have to be like a scary thing, right? So authentic being a self is not based on an exceptional state of the subject, detached from the they, but it is an existential modification. That's really interesting. An existential modification would be a factual modification, something that has a limit, something that is more present and ontic. Of the they, oh, okay, so it's not an existential modification of us or the I, it's an existential modification of the they. So a restructuring of the they will lead to further authenticity as an essential existential. So the existential affects the existential. All right, so I'm going to take a break, and we really haven't even gotten into this section, which was why I just wanted to do one section. But when we come back, we will learn more about the different characteristics of Dasein. We've talked about the first two, being in the world and contained in care. Hello, okay, we're back. All right, so let's move on. All right, so the next sentence I want to talk about is this one. The term existence formally indicates that Dasein is, as an understanding, potentiality of being, which is concerned in its being about being. So there I see, I'm going to add two more characteristics, being in the world, contained in care, and now potentiality of being. We are always a potential. We never really are, not for at least an extended period of time. We're always moving toward some, or really ever, because we might be, his perspective might be that we're always moving towards something. We're always growing. Today, I will be this list of characteristics that I could write down maybe, or think of, or acknowledge. Tomorrow, things will be a little evolved. We can't really stop changing or moving or growing from one second to another. Because that's what life is, right? That's what really, if we say something is alive, then, millions of processes are going on and continuing to go on. So I think potentiality of being is not super hard to understand, but it's important. And then I think it's really interesting, concerned in its being about being. So we're kind of, I wish I had my first perspective of this is just that we are self-involved. Can we say we're narcissistic? Probably that's a really reductive perspective, and my understanding of this will grow. Maybe you have a better word for it, but concerned in its being, that's a little more generous and gracious. Concerned in its being about its being. We're always aware of ourselves, maybe, and maybe this has to do with self-consciousness, maybe, I don't know what it has to do with exactly. I really don't want to be definitive about any of these things I'm saying. I'm just trying to explore right now what this might be. So how can we see that? Concerned in its being about its being. We're always thinking about how things can affect us. We're always concerned with our being in the world. I don't know, but it's something to put down as a characteristic and to see if we can fill in the gaps as we continue on, reading, either on your own or if I come back to this book. Okay, so let's see. We talk about entanglement again. He reiterates that on the site, so this is the first sentence of the second paragraph, we are searching for the answer to the question of the meaning of being in general. Okay, there you go. That is what we're doing. And so he's just confirming that's what we're doing. All right, so moving to the next page. So let's see, the first sentence of his third paragraph, we get into this a little more, the primordial part that I said I was really interested in. So he asks, are we entitled to the claim that in characterizing Dasein ontologically as care, we have given a primordial interpretation of this being? And then he kind of just asks 3 more questions about it. And he says, okay, so here is an important sentence. Every interpretation, so this is in the German 232, the next paragraph. Every interpretation has its forehaving, its foresight, and its foreconception. If such an interpretation becomes an explicit task of an inquiry, the totality of these presuppositions needs to be clarified and made secure beforehand, both in a fundamental experience of the object to be disclosed and in terms of that experience. In ontological interpretation, beings are to be freed with regard to their own constitution of being. Okay, so let's pretend I didn't read that sentence. Okay, so for having foresight and for conception. So basically, he's saying in our inquiry, in our investigation of being, we come to it with something. And this makes sense because, well, for one, someone in my group did say when I was there for 5 minutes that helped me kind of reach the second thing that I'm going to say. He said, if you were looking for something, you already have an inkling of that something, but at a level we do not know about explicitly. And that's true. Like if I'm trying to find the meaning of life, well, where did the phrase the meaning of life come from? Where did the possibility that there could be something that I don't know come from? I had it within me. And you could say, well, I got it from my parents or my culture. What about the first human beings, we can say, if there were, if we can make that line in evolution, or the first conscious beings, whatever you want to call, if it's however human those beings were, maybe the searching for the meaning of life has always been with us. And so it's a constitution, or all living things, who it belongs to, I'm not sure. But, so what, that person said was really interesting. And so that made me just sort of re-articulate it as we have experience of our being before we know it. We know we are a being, and we are a being. It's not like we become a being. And as we become the being, the more we become the being, the more we know the being. And the more we know the being, the more we become a being. But we are already a being. We are already life. We are already this sort of seemingly individual entity that has consciousness, that has private thoughts, that is entangled in the world, that is obsessed with itself and obsessed with caring for the world and in the world and for the self, and being thrown and wavering between the inauthentic and the authentic. I mean, we are investigating as we are in the chaos. It's kind of like what people say about history, hindsight is 20/20. You can only, and I think even Hegel says this as well. He says in the philosophy of mind that the tragedy, or maybe it's in some other text, but he says the tragedy of life is that we can only understand it after we go through it. So we can only it's hard to reflect, like for instance, at the time I'm doing this podcast, there's a pandemic going on, and it might be the new normal, but it's hard to reflect what's going on. What I'm seeing now is very different from what I was seeing in March 2020. Now it's August 2021 for me. Right now as I'm recording this. So, new things crop up, but also, what I am seeing now, wasn't it always there, in terms of the role of government and restrictions and agendas and things all that like that. Wasn't it there always? What did I miss? What was I focused on more? So anyway, I think that this we have experience of our being before we know it is what he's really is one way we can look at it, at least. This primordiality is we always are what we are, and what we are is a potentiality. But when he talks about this forehaving, foresight, and foreconception, these presuppositions, so these need to be that's an interesting place to have as a space of inquiry as well, right? So, so what else can we say? How do I get to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which was authenticity. Okay, so that's what, that paragraph is about. And, further down on the German 232, he mentions assurance. And he mentions phenomenal certainty. So again, phenomenology gives you the assurance, because what it is it's focusing on what we can encounter. So I'll just read this first sentence. But a primordial ontological interpretation requires not only in general that the hermeneutical situation or our presuppositions be secured in conformity with the phenomena. So not only, so whatever we are doing or seeking existentially, it has to be in conformity with the phenomena, but also the explicit assurance that the totality of the beings taken as its theme have been brought to a forehaving. I mean, I'm not sure that is an assurance, actually, now that I read it. Because the fact that I come to my sort of investigation with presuppositions is not assuring. But maybe he's not saying assuring in the way that I want assurance to be. Yeah, so I don't know. So we have to, we are always going to, we can't step out of ourselves, I guess. So we should be assured that we can't step out of ourselves, which, I don't know. And then I'm just going to skip down. Only then can the question of the meaning of the unity that belongs to the totality of being of all beings be asked and answered with phenomenal certainty. So there's some sort of, I don't know, I feel like a connection to Hegel here every time I see the word unity. And he's talking about, not an individual. I mean, he's talking about our individual experience that is shared. So that is where the unity is. So then he asks another question, which is helpful because it just reassures me that, this is a journey and he's not expecting us to know what we don't know before we know it. What is the status of the foresight which has been guiding our ontological procedure up to now? We defined the idea of existence as a potentiality of being, a potentiality that understands and is concerned about its own being. So he's repeating that. But this potentiality of being that is always mine. Okay, so I would say that maybe that's like a fifth or a sixth point. This idea of being mine is free for authenticity or inauthenticity, or for a mode in which neither of these have been differentiated. So sometimes, what does that mean if sometimes you can't differentiate the authentic from the inauthentic? Our previous interpretation, starting out with average everydayness, can find itself, and this is where I see him saying that the first half is about inauthenticity, can find itself to the analysis of indifferent or inauthentic existing. So that's kind of a new thought for me. What does indifferent existing mean? And why is it a synonym for inauthentic existing? I don't know. I'm going to have to write a question mark right there. Okay. So let's see. So then he just basically goes on to say very simply that, this is flawed because it's lacking the authentic side. So the authentic potentiality of being. And so that's really what he's saying in the next, several sentences. So he says, here's a sentence of clarity on the German 233, page 223 in the Stambaugh. Everydayness is, after all, precisely the being between birth and death. So that's what he's talking about. Oh, but I'm almost running out of time, but here's the second thing I want to talk about, and it is on the German 234, and now I have found a connection to it. So he basically talks about, I'll just kind of summarize my opinion of it before I get into quotes. So basically he's saying that we are only whole in death. He says, as long as Dasein is, something is always still outstanding, what it can and will be. So the potentiality. So as long as we're alive, there's a potentiality. And then he says, the end of being in the world is death. This end belonging to the potentiality of being, that is, to existence, limits and defines the possible totality of Dasein. So you are Dassain until you really, end. And we can't really experience our death. And that's what, was also talked about in the first section. We can experience maybe it's the section that's coming up. No, it is the section that's coming up. Okay, the section that's coming up is really talking about death. Chapter 1 is titled The Possible Being a Whole of Dasein and Being Toward Death. We're always being toward death in life, but we can't experience our own death. It says, but as far as Dasein goes, death is only an existential being toward death. The existential structure of this being turns out to be the ontological constitution of this potentiality for being whole of Dasein. Thus, the whole existing Dasein can be brought into our existential for having. So we have ideas of being whole, but we're never really going to be whole until we are dead. But there are, again, different kinds of deaths, right? There's death and rebirth. If you look at it existentially, an existential death and an existential rebirth, that contrasts with the existential dying that we can never experience, and we're always just going toward. So that's what I think he's saying there. And then he starts to introduce temporality, finally, in the last four paragraphs. He says, the primordial ontological ground of this existentiality of Dasein, however, is temporality. The articulated structural total of the being of Dasein as care first comes existentially intelligible in terms of temporality. And further down he says, everydayness reveals itself as a mode of temporality. And that's what I think that for me, that really just connects with what I was saying before, is that we get glimpses of ourselves and we understand ourselves, of our authentic selves in moments, and then we understand other aspects of ourselves in other moments. That's why Dasein is and can be historical. So he talks about the vulgar understanding of time, the traditional concept of time, and then probably, I think, the third, what is time existentially? So anyway, I have to stop there because I only have 60 minutes. Hopefully I didn't go over. So I hope that was helpful, just going, at least seeing what the chaos is in my mind. But I don't know, I thought section 45 was very clarifying for me. It helped me understand what I just read and what I'm going to read.